Final Fantasy XIV, despite how nice it looks, is an insanely janky game. For those that have played the game for a long time, it is commonly accepted that the game, at times, seems to be held together by rubber bands, duct tape, and a dream. So it probably won't surprise you that a lot of the jank of the game is so deep that it is something that interacts directly with combat. In this video, I want to go over 10 pieces of jank in the game in a way that is detailed enough that you can play around it in the future. And if you know of some weird jank, do let me know about it in the comments. Number 1. Animation locking. Sometimes known by other names, but essentially, whenever a character performs an action or does something, it locks them into that action, disabling them from using any other action until this animation lock is over. You can, typically, still move, however. Certain actions have an unusually long animation lock, like examples such as Dragoon's Stardiver that, broadly speaking, is typically seen as taking about twice as long as a normal action before it fully resolves. However, for most actions, the animation locking time period is approximately 0.6 seconds plus twice your latency. Sometimes, this estimate is closer to 0.58 seconds plus twice your latency. However, the broad strokes is that a latency less than 20 ms or so is relatively rare, as far as I know, so this information combined means that it is reasonable to assume that the animation lock for a good connection is like 0.625, which perfectly matches a fourth of the global cooldown. Now, the game never actually tells you that, so as a new player, it likely feels like the game being extremely unresponsive. But, indeed, it means that you can only do one thing per animation lock. But what this means for you as a player is also that even an action that purports to be instant actually takes a bit more than half a second to do, so you cannot, in fact, fit that instant ability in the global cooldown of a 2-second spellcast with a global cooldown of 2.5 seconds. Example: Adloquium for Scholar. Speaking of cast times, the animation lock is contained in the last bit of the cast time itself. We'll get back to this in a bit. Number 2. Action queuing, frame rate, and latency on actions. Let's start with the last thing here. As I mentioned, latency affects your ability to use actions, as the animation lock essentially includes 2 times your latency in the animation lock. Why? Well, your client has to tell the server you do a thing, and the server has to make sure you finish before you can start doing a new thing. That might not be exactly how it works, but it is approximately how it works. What this means is that if you play on a latency of, say, 100 ms, the previously mentioned animation lock is actually closer to 0.8 seconds. Slightly more than that, and you can no longer double weave at all. The concept of using 2 abilities in the global cooldown window of 2 instant weapon skills or spells. There's also slightly more to this jank, but we will get back to that even later. Action queuing, more commonly known as spell queuing, is the feature that makes it so that if you press an action a moment before it is ready, the game will use the action on time anyway, by queuing the action for when it is possible. Technically, if you press an action that is ready, it still queues it. It simply queues it for the next possible frame. I'll get to this in a moment. Speaking of frames in this specific aspect, some of you may have experienced that macros feel very unresponsive in this game. There are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that macros are not affected by spell queuing. The second is that macros are played 1 frame per line. This means that a 16-line macro will take 16 frames of gameplay to resolve fully. This is also why most combat macros have 14 or so repetitions of the same line, to make it attempt to use the action as many times as possible. This also means that macros are less responsive the higher the frame rate of your game. Let's just say that macros often feel like they're deliberately made janky to be bad for combat, which does make sense, since some of the capabilities of macros would enable you to set up simple automation, so making sure this is inferior to real player gameplay is somewhat important, I guess? Now, for the frame rate thing, you heard me mention next possible frame before. Indeed, for some reason, when you command your character to use an action, your client tells the server that it wants to do that action on the first valid frame of gameplay on your client where this action can happen. Let's say you're playing on a stable 60 FPS and your GCD is 2.47. Assuming you use your GCD exactly on time, every time, one GCD would happen exactly at time 0, but the next GCD should then happen 2.47 seconds later, right? Well, if we define the frame you used the first GCD on as frame 0, then frame 148 will happen 2.467 seconds later, meaning too soon for your GCD. And frame 149 happens at 2.4833 and will be the frame your GCD is initiated. This means, effectively, that whether your GCD is 2.47 or 2.48 is same if your frame rate is actually a stable 60. For a few select jobs that care a lot about their GCD aligning perfectly with this or that, this can be more problematic and most often comes into conversation in relation to Monk. However, overall, this jank adds up to a relatively minuscule damage loss, if any, and you don't need this level of perfection for any job or any content. It is interesting to know though. A common preference for some players is to have their GCD be 2.49 specifically instead of 2.50 to make sure they don't get screwed over by frame rates though. Number 3. The Lagging Swiftcast. If your latency is over a certain threshold, I've managed to make it happen with at least 300 ms, the time it takes for the effect of an action to apply is longer than your actual animation lock, allowing you to initiate a new action before the effect of the previous action has taken place, somehow. The most commonly seen case of this is Swiftcast and Raise. If your latency is over this threshold, it is possible to use Swiftcast and then start casting Raise, missing the Swiftcast buff. It also means that you could weave Swiftcast, cast a spell properly, followed by the instant cast afterwards, like for example a Black Mage using Xenoglossy, weaving Swiftcast, normally casting the 6th Fire 4, and then instant casting Flare Star through the previously weaved Swiftcast. This kind of jank makes a lot of jobs feel weird to play obviously, but I would say the worst impacted of the jobs is probably Red Mage, as every cast that gives dual cast has this problem. Number 4. Slidecasting. In relation to the previously discussed animation locking, actions with a cast time benefit from the concept known as slidecasting. The way it works is that when you cast something, the game actually recognizes the spell as finished about half a second before the cast actually finishes. This is when the animation lock takes place. In this time frame, not only will the game light up other actions such as emotes as if they are usable, but you can freely move despite the animation suggesting you're technically still casting. Similar to the animation locking thing in general, the game never explains this, so players will either recognize this as the game being buggy or lag. In fact, I made a short about this specific concept a long time ago, and many players from other MMOs specifically looked at it and said, "Lamau, that's just lag." Essentially, what this piece of jank means is that all actions with cast times leave about half a second at the end where you can move, even if the cast time is longer than the GCD. This weird interaction also has a knock-on effect on 2 other mechanics in the game. Number 5. Mage auto attacks. This one is actually 2 things. The first thing is that while you cast something, your auto attack swing timer pauses. However, your swing timer has already resumed when the slidecasting window begins. This means that, for example, a Paladin's Holy Spirit, if cast normally, delays your auto attacks by 1 second, not 1.5. Similarly, a Black Mage casting Fire 4 for 2.8 seconds delays their auto attack by 2.3 seconds. The second thing is related to specifically mages. Many of you have probably noticed that auto attacks from healers and caster DPS are rather pathetic even, right? That kinda makes sense, but 1 damage? Really? It gets even weirder when you realize that these magic user jobs do more damage with their auto attacks at lower level. Notably, White Mage does about 17 damage with their auto attacks at level 90, but at level 100, 1 damage. This was less obvious in Endwalker when only Black Mage did exactly 1 damage with their auto attacks at 90. The long and the short of it is that magic users gain too little strength per level up to keep up with the scaling stat requirements. You may have noticed that despite having more and more stats like crit on higher level gear, we still haven't reached some weird threshold where everything crits. This is because when you level up, the needed amount of crit to gain, say, 0.1% crit chance and damage increases. For comparison, you need around 14 crit to gain plus 0.1% chance at level 100, but only 9.5 at level 90. Stats like strength have this kind of increasing requirement too, although it is usually a lot less obvious, since the jobs that actually use those stats always have plenty of them. But magic users don't, which lead to most of them doing basically nothing. At the moment, it appears only Summoner and Scholar do more than basically no damage with their auto attacks, with Sage doing about 8 without any party bonus or any other outside help. It has this kinda mild, janky feeling of a game that has a mechanic in it that is probably fine, surely it won't break as the stats increase over the years. And here we are, more than 10 years later. Number 6. Cast attacks. You might recall that I said the animation log for using an action was about 0.6 seconds, not 0.5. The slidecasting window is approximately half a second, give or take. Essentially, we can view it as the animation log from the cast bleeds out of the actual cast time itself and eats up about 0.1 second extra. So, a spell with a 1 second cast time, hypothetically, would take 1.1 seconds to fully resolve. A spell with a 1.5 second cast time takes 1.6 seconds before you can weave something. Given the cast times of most actions, as long as your latency is alright, this doesn't really matter. That plus 0.1 second on that Loquium isn't going to make or break things, you already couldn't weave after it without clipping the GCD. However, the actions where this does become a problem is with spells with cast times equal to or exceeding the GCD. Black Mage's Fire 1 doesn't take 2.5 seconds to resolve, it takes 2.6. Fire 4 doesn't take 2.8 seconds to resolve, it takes 2.9. Flare Star doesn't take 3 seconds to resolve, it takes 3.1. Aside from Black Mage, who has a large selection of actions interacting with this jank, the only job actions that has this issue that are not Black Mage actions are Reaper's Soul Sow, while in combat, and Red Mage's Thunder and Vaero without dual cast. All of these cases take 5.1 seconds to cast. All other long cast time actions nowadays simply have even longer GCDs, painting over cast attacks. Number 7. Oddly late attacks, missing entirely. Some might call this attack snapshots, some call it hit detection, some call it something else. The idea is that many actions don't apply their effect exactly on the frame where the action starts resolving. Often, it takes a little bit. In a lot of cases, it makes perfect sense because the damage or healing or effect is applied when the animation lands. You cast Fire 1, the damage appears when the little fireball touches the target. You cast Fire 4, the damage appears when the explosion happens. It makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't really make full sense though. This is more common with attacks with multiple hits in the animation. The only way to make them make full sense is if the attack actually hits multiple times. But they often don't. An example of this is Warrior Storm's Path and Storm's Eye. They both hit about 2 times with smaller swings in the animation and then finish with a proper slash with the axe, which is when the damage occurs. This isn't the only case of this, but these actions are so slow that it actually can matter, and Warrior has certain actions that resolve on damage application, notably Bloodwetting and Nascent Flash, with Bloodwetting still healing if the attack comes out late, but Nascent Flash can actually miss it. The main time these kind of things can be a real problem is with bosses that disappear, become untargetable, or invulnerable. Even if you use the attack in time, the boss disappearing typically means that the damage doesn't connect. There isn't that much you can do with this knowledge beyond going, well, if Storm's Path isn't going to make it, I guess I'll have to use something else. Number 8. Dot and hot tick timings. In Final Fantasy XIV, passive HP and MP regen happens on a consistent timer all the time for your character. Dots and hots also tick in unison, unrelated to when they were applied. That means when you apply a dot like Biolysis to an enemy, it will tick 10 times in the 30 seconds. However, whether the first tick happens immediately or up to 2.99 seconds later depends on this universal timer. This is also why most healing over time and damage over time effects last a multiple of 3 seconds, to be on the safe side. It also means, technically, that if you time it just right, you could have your dot or hot drop off your target for like 2.5 seconds and reapply it in time without losing a single tick. But due to other mechanics like the animation locking and attack snapshotting, this is really difficult to do consistently and simply doesn't add very much value anyway. Number 9. Lingering buffs from temporary fields. In association with the previous piece of jank, you may sometimes notice that placed fields, or pulsing effects you could say, last longer than they're supposed to. Two notable examples of this is Scholar's Sacred Soil and Paladin's Passage of Arms. For Sacred Soil, weirdly, the damage reduction component lasts one extra tick of about 3 seconds longer than the dome itself. This gets even more weird when you realize that placed circles like Sacred Soil and Asylum hits an extra time when placed. This also applies to offensive ones like Salted Earth and Doton. Paladin's Passage of Arms similarly gets a bit weird. You may have heard of, or even seen, paladins flashing their wings for just a fraction of a second, with good reason too. The damage reduction Passage of Arms applies to party members behind the paladin actually lasts approximately 2 ticks or so, meaning around 5 or 6 seconds. What makes this interaction so weird is that the action could just give a duration of this effect, but it doesn't. But the important part is that these temporary fields start sooner than you'd think and end later than you'd think. Finally, number 10. Actively moving characters are all ghosts. Don't worry, I'm not crazy. Okay, maybe a bit crazy, but hear me out. Have you ever experienced a mechanic hitting you despite you clearly being out of it on your screen? How about being hit by a spread marker on someone else that happens to be running towards you, but again, you were clearly ahead enough that it shouldn't hit you? Well, as this game is affected by latency in general, while a character is actively moving, the visual representation of where they are for themselves is in the future and for everyone else in the past. The exact time difference can vary depending on latency of course, but let me pose an example. If you got hit by a mechanic and need to evaluate why things went wrong, you would need both a picture of your perspective and a picture from someone else looking at you's perspective. You would clearly see yourself being out of the mechanic, while on the other perspective, you would clearly be flat out in the mechanic, no discussion. If you find the position perfectly between the position you see and the position they see, that would almost certainly be relatively close to what the server sees, which, in some capacity, is what ultimately counts. This is also why that spread marker example happens as well. On your screen, you're further ahead and the one chasing you is farther behind. On their screen, you're closer to them and they're closer to you. Incidentally, for the average between those two results, if that still means you're in the spread marker, you get hit. So, do you know of some really wacky jank in Final Fantasy XIV, or did you learn something new or finally understood some jank from this set of 10? Do let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Sage's Keracholi reads as if it is a perfect clone of Scholar's Sacred Soil, just without a dome you have to stand in. However, because Sacred Soil takes an extra time when placed, as long as everyone stays in the dome, Sacred Soil is actually the superior option of the two, thanks to jank, as it both heals one more tick and lasts about one extra tick with the damage reduction.